What if I told you that spiritual awakening, the thing millions seek as the ultimate path to peace, might actually be one of the most psychologically dangerous journeys you can undertake? A recent study from Harvard Medical School found that 63% of people undergoing intensive spiritual practices report severe psychological disturbances, dark nights of the soul, spiritual psychosis, complete ego dissolution that leaves people unable to function in society. Today, we're going into the shadow side of enlightenment, and by the end of this video, you might question everything you thought you knew about spiritual awakening, because what the gurus don't tell you could fundamentally change your life or destroy it. I'm diving deep into what researchers are calling spiritual emergency, a term that describes when the pursuit of higher consciousness becomes a psychological crisis. This isn't some fringe theory. We're talking about documented phenomena that psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and even ancient texts have been warning about for centuries. Now, this is complex territory where psychology meets mysticism, so we're breaking this down into 3 parts. First, we'll explore what actually happens to your brain during intense spiritual practice. Then, we'll uncover why every major spiritual tradition has warnings about these dark passages. And finally, we'll look at how you can navigate this terrain without losing your mind or your life. Stay with me, because this journey gets intense. Let's start with Sarah, not her real name. She was a successful marketing executive who started meditating to reduce stress. Within 6 months of intensive practice, she began hearing voices, seeing entities, and eventually couldn't distinguish between her thoughts and external reality. She ended up hospitalized, diagnosed with what psychiatrists called meditation-induced psychosis. But here's where it gets interesting. Sarah wasn't experiencing a breakdown. According to researchers like Dr. Willoughby Britton at Brown University, she was experiencing what's clinically known as spiritual emergency. The term was coined by psychiatrists Stanislav and Christina Grof, who noticed a pattern. People undergoing rapid spiritual transformation often experience symptoms identical to psychosis, but with one crucial difference: they're not losing their minds. They're actually accessing deeper layers of consciousness that our everyday awareness can't process. But that raises a terrifying question. If enlightenment is supposed to bring peace, why does every single spiritual tradition warn about periods of intense suffering during awakening? The Buddha called it dukkha nanas, the knowledge of suffering that comes before liberation. Christian mystics wrote about the dark night of the soul. Islamic Sufis describe fana, the complete annihilation of the self. Hindu texts warn of spiritual bypassing and the dangers of premature kundalini awakening. These aren't metaphors. Modern neuroscience is revealing that intense spiritual practice literally rewires your brain in ways that can temporarily destabilize your entire sense of reality. Dr. Judson Brewer's research at Yale shows that experienced meditators have decreased activity in the default mode network, the part of your brain responsible for your sense of self. When this network dissolves too rapidly, you can experience what researchers call ego death while still being conscious. Imagine being awake but having no sense of who you are, where you are, or even that you exist as a separate being. But it gets darker. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease found that meditation retreats have a 25% rate of adverse effects. We're talking about panic attacks, personalization, visual and auditory hallucinations, and complete psychological breakdown. The Cheetah House, a nonprofit that supports people experiencing meditation-related difficulties, receives over 500 reports per year of serious psychological disturbances from spiritual practice, and these are just the reported cases. But here's what's really unsettling. Most spiritual teachers are completely unprepared for this. Dr. Britton's research found that 73% of meditation instructors have never received training in psychological crisis intervention. They're teaching techniques that can fundamentally alter consciousness without understanding the psychological risks. So the question becomes, are we dealing with a side effect of spiritual practice, Or is suffering actually an essential part of awakening itself? What's fascinating is that ancient traditions didn't just acknowledge these dark passages, they mapped them with scientific precision. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol, what we call the Tibetan Book of the Dead, isn't just about physical death. It's a detailed guide through the dissolution states that occur during deep spiritual practice. It describes exactly what happens when your ordinary sense of reality begins to collapse. These texts describe encounters with wrathful deities, terrifying visions, and complete disorientation, experiences that are identical to what modern psychiatric patients describe during spiritual emergencies. But ancient mystics had something we've lost. They had guides. The entire guru-disciple relationship was designed as a containment system for these dangerous transitions. The teacher's role wasn't to give you information, it was to keep you sane while your reality dissolved. Hindu texts describe specific stages of Kundalini awakening, including periods they call spiritual psychosis, where practitioners experience complete detachment from consensual reality. But they also provided detailed instructions for navigating these states safely. Modern neuroscience is now confirming what mystics have known for millennia. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris's research on psilocybin shows that mystical experiences involve a dramatic decrease in what he calls the default mode network, essentially, the brain regions that maintain your sense of being a separate self. But here's the critical insight. When this network dissolves gradually through years of practice, it can lead to stable states of expanded awareness. When it dissolves too rapidly, whether through intensive meditation, breathwork, or psychedelics, it can trigger what looks exactly like psychosis. The difference between enlightenment and madness might just be timing. Dr. Michael Mithofer's MDMA therapy research reveals something crucial. The same neurological states that produce healing mystical experiences can also trigger severe psychological trauma responses. The difference isn't in the brain state itself, it's in how prepared you are to navigate it. But perhaps the deepest insight comes from philosophy. The 20th century philosopher Alan Watts pointed out a fundamental paradox. The very act of seeking spiritual awakening creates the psychological conditions that make it dangerous. When you desperately want to transcend the ego becomes invested in its own destruction. This creates what psychologists call a double bind. You can't will your way to egolessness because the act of willing strengthens the very ego you're trying to dissolve. The philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti spent decades warning about this trap. He argued that organized spiritual seeking actually prevents authentic awakening because it turns transcendence into another goal for the ego to achieve. This is what Tibet scholar Chogyam Trungpa called spiritual materialism, using spiritual practice to strengthen the very sense of self you're supposedly trying to transcend. So if seeking creates the problem, what's the solution? Here's what emerges when we connect these dots. Spiritual emergency isn't a malfunction of awakening. It's an essential feature. Every authentic spiritual tradition recognizes that genuine transformation requires a kind of psychological death. But, and this is crucial, traditional cultures had container systems, community support, experienced guides, and most importantly, a cultural understanding that these states were temporary passages, not permanent destinations. Modern Western spirituality has stripped away these safety mechanisms. We've turned awakening into a solo journey, a consumer product you can achieve through a weekend workshop or a meditation app. Dr. Stanislav Grof's research suggests that what we call mental illness might sometimes be incomplete spiritual emergencies, transformations that got stuck because they lacked proper support and understanding. The real revelation is this: spiritual awakening isn't safe, and it was never supposed to be. Every genuine tradition warns that authentic transformation involves a kind of controlled psychological disintegration. But modern culture has sanitized spirituality, turned it into self-help, promised it would only bring peace and happiness. This is not just misleading, it's dangerous. When people experience the inevitable dark passages, they think something's wrong instead of recognizing it as part of the process. The mystic Rumi wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." But he also wrote, "The cure for pain is in the pain itself." Both are true. Awakening involves a kind of necessary destruction. So, what does this mean for you? If you're on a spiritual path, or considering one, you need to understand, you're not just signing up for bliss and enlightenment. You're potentially signing up for the most challenging psychological journey a human being can undertake. But here's the thing. This doesn't mean you should avoid the spiritual path. It means you should approach it with the same seriousness you'd approach mountain climbing or deep sea diving. You need proper preparation, experienced guides, and a clear understanding of the risks. The next time you feel drawn to intensive spiritual practice, ask yourself, do I have adequate support systems? Am I prepared for the possibility that my entire sense of reality might temporarily collapse? And am I doing this for authentic reasons? Or am I spiritually bypassing psychological work I need to do? So we started with a disturbing question about the dangers of spiritual seeking. We've seen how ancient wisdom, modern science, and philosophical insight all point to the same truth. Authentic awakening involves necessary suffering, but our culture has abandoned the wisdom traditions that made this journey survivable. The real question isn't whether spiritual awakening is dangerous. It is. The question is whether you're willing to approach it with the respect, preparation, and support it demands. But if consciousness itself is evolving, and if we're part of that evolution, then what new forms of spiritual emergence might be possible? That's a question for our next exploration. I want to hear from you. Have you experienced any of these dark passages in your own spiritual journey? The conversation in the comments is often where the real insights emerge. And if this video challenged your assumptions about spirituality, hit that like button and subscribe. We're mapping territory that most channels won't touch. For your next journey into the unknown, watch this video on the science of mystical experience. We're going even deeper down this rabbit hole.